We're looking at English translations, and this morning we're going to come to the second period of English translations. We saw our first period, we said, ran from around 450 to 1100, or from the invasion of the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons up until the invasion of the Normans. And this is, of course, our Old English period, or our Anglo-Saxon period. That's the language then, our Old English or Anglo-Saxon. Now we're through with that. I think we looked at 8 important works there. Kedman, Aldhelm, Egbert, Bede, Alfred, the Glosses, the Wessex Gospels, and Alfred. And so this morning we come to our second period. We said that both these periods are bounded, these two periods are bounded on the left and the right by something important. This is bounded on this side by the invasion of the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. That's what begins this period. And this period ends with the invasion of Britain again. It starts with and it ends with an invasion of the Normans, spelled just like it sounds, N-O-R-M-A-N. Well, if this period ends with the invasion of the Normans, so does this one begin, with the invasion of the Normans, and it ends with the invention of the printing press. And these are rounded off dates, of course. This is not totally specific. The year here is really 1066, the Battle of Hastings, that famous battle, but we're just going to round it off to 1100. Of course, the printing press wasn't invented in the year 1500. It was invented a half a century earlier. So we're just rounding the dates off. So this runs, and we'll probably have 4 messages under here. This counting this morning. It's 1 this morning and 3 more, so not very much. Then, of course, we'll go from 1500 to the year 2000. Now we start December tomorrow, do we not? Amen. And we're knocking on the door of the 3rd millennium of the Christian era. We're not that far away from 2000. So what? We've got 650 years here, 400 years here, and 500 years there, just to show you how long these periods have been. 650 to begin with, and then 400, then it goes down, and then it goes back up. 650, just to compare how long these periods have been. Of course, we don't know how long the earth is going to last, but I'm sure as long as it continues, or at least up until close to the end, we're going to continue to have English translations of the Bible. Now, I've given you 8 examples back here, remember. We'll probably have about 8 examples. Yeah, we'll probably have about 8 examples here. Wycliffe will be the one big name that we'll spend 2 or 3 messages. Most of our time, maybe 3. Maybe 3/4 of our study here will just deal with John Wycliffe, or Wycliffe, however you want to pronounce it. And of course, down here, there's almost no end. I'm sure there's a last number, 844 English translations. I don't know all of them. So almost you could say without end to the English translations down here in the modern period. And remember that this is Old English here, this is Middle English here, and we could say this is modern English here. So those are the periods to kind of keep in mind. Whenever we get to the beginning of our 3rd or the modern period, we'll look at some things that changed in Europe that really brings about that period. Okay, this 400-year period from 1100 to 1500, our Middle English period, is the period of people like John Wycliffe, who lived around 1329 to 1384. 1329 to 1384. He's probably, well, definitely as far as Bible work and Bible translation is concerned, and maybe just as far as biblical scholars are concerned of his day. He certainly was probably the world's leading biblical scholar in his day. So he's a very important man during this period. And a contemporary of his is Geoffrey Chaucer. C-H-A-U-C-E-R. Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of Canterbury Tales, who lived 1340 to 1400. So they live almost exactly in the same period of time. Geoffrey Chaucer is an Englishman also, remember. So it kind of works like this. Back in school days, if and when you studied Geoffrey Chaucer and Canterbury Tales, generally it's not pointed out that he was a contemporary of Wycliffe. And then whenever, on the other hand, whenever you study John Wycliffe in Christian circles, it's generally never pointed out that he was a contemporary with Geoffrey Chaucer. So we're trying to draw both of those together because these are two very famous individuals. From a Christian point of view, Wycliffe would dominate, and well, I hate even to say from, a writing point of view, Chaucer, because Wycliffe's important. But as far as, English literature is concerned, I guess Chaucer would rank higher than John Wycliffe. It's not totally certain that Wycliffe did any of the translating work himself anyway. So if that were the case, then definitely Chaucer would rank above him in English literature because we wouldn't really have any of the writings of John Wycliffe. Okay, then what we want to begin discussing then is the invasion of England by the Normans, people who came to be called Normans because they settled in an area that came to be called Normandy, and I guess it's a little difficult to know which name came from which. These men, they were Western Scandinavian sea raiders whose seafaring raids just terrorized Europe during the 8th and the 9th centuries. We also happen to be, if you notice this date, somewhere around the same period as the Vikings. And I'm sure you've heard all of the Vikings, not from Minnesota, but from Scandinavia. And Leif Erikson and some of these famous people. This is during the same period of time. The Vikings are Norsemen, or Northmen, or Norse, or Scandinavian, or Norwegian, or Normans. Well, not totally Normans, but they all fit in the same stock of people, the Vikings during this period. I don't think we'll take the time to draw a whole map up here. I'll probably put a partial one up here in a moment, but if we come over with Europe in this direction, we have France and Spain over here and the British Isles here. Then all of you've got your three Scandinavian countries, Sweden and so forth, that dip down there, and you've got one, Denmark, that goes up there. And over on the western side, this is the locale for these particular men. They go by a lot of different names. They're called the Norse. They're called Norsemen. They're called Northmen because they come from the north. You probably know them as Norwegians. Once they settle down in Normandy, they become known as Normans. Those names, all of those names that I've written up there, are not directly synonymous. Especially not this last one, the Normans, because they settle in a particular area. But they do all come from the Western Scandinavian countries, or you could put Scandinavian down if you want a big word that starts with a C. I was trying to give you all N's because it's easy to remember. The Norse, the Norsemen, the Northmen, the Norwegians, and the Normans. Anyway, what I said about them was that their seafaring raids terrorized Europe during the 8th and 9th centuries particularly. Then they finally settled down in western France. We're going to be talking about their invasion of England. We're going to have to see how did they actually have some interplay with the British Isles. They finally settled down in western France. Again, if we just give ourselves a partial map, we have Spain and Portugal down here, and let's give ourselves France right here, the British Isles. They finally settled down over here in western France. This would be the British Isles. In a territory that became known as Normandy. Well, now with them in France, how did they actually have some dealings with the English people? Well, their interference into the affairs of England came about through the death of King Edward the Confessor. A lot of the kings had some other name attached to them. You're probably more familiar with people like Richard the Lion-Hearted, but a lot of them have different names. Here's King Edward the Confessor. Now he's a British king, an English king. King Edward the Confessor. Whenever he died in the year 1066, a pivotal date in world history, by the way, then this gave the Northmen, or the Normans down in France, gave them their opportunity to interfere with the affairs of England. Now, Edward, King of England, Edward the Confessor, had actually been educated and brought up in Normandy. I've said that these Scandinavian Northmen actually terrorized Europe as early as the 8th and 9th centuries, and it's not until around this time they've settled down in France. But that means not only have they settled down in France, but there are probably a lot of them up here in England as well. And a lot of the English people have come down here, and so there is a mingling of the people. And Edward, who's going to become King of England, he is educated and brought up down here in Normandy, which is, let's say, the western province here of France. Now, at his death in the year 1066, there was a dispute as to who the rightful English successor should be to the throne. There was a contention between two individuals. You have to know this little bit about world history to understand something of the introduction of this period of English translations. Because let me just give you a little clue ahead of time before we even get very far. After the Norman invasion, we have a similar series of events, or a similar result, I might say, that's comparable to what happened in England after the period of the invasion of the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons. And that is no translations taking place. Well, then that's something important for us. Why have we had all this work from Kedmon's time right up through Alfred's time that seems to be increasing, more and more people doing something as far as translation is concerned? And so why discuss the Normans? Why discuss their invasion? What's the big deal about that? Translation work stops. And if we just were studying translations and didn't do a little bit of study about world history, we'd have to ask ourselves, why do we have 200 years of relative quiet as far as English translation work is concerned? And then we'd have to go back and we'd have to backtrack and go into this a little bit. So that's why we're starting with that right now this morning. The contention was between two people, I said, as to the rightful successor to the English throne after the death of Edward. One of those was Harold, who was the eldest son of Earl Godwin. The eldest son of Earl Godwin, Godwin. Godwin was a powerful Saxon advisor to the king, King Edward, as well as his father-in-law. Which means that King Edward must have married the sister of Harold, which would make the late King Edward and Harold one of the potential successors to the throne after his death, brothers-in-law. So there was one of the contenders for the English throne. The second one was William. All good English names. William, who was Duke of Normandy, which put him, of course, on the other side of the English Channel, which is no big deal. Edward had been raised there. So it's not like these are foreigners or something. He was Duke of Normandy, and he was second cousin to the late King, Edward the Confessor. So they are related as well. So it seems like everyone is related. So we have a contest between Harold, a brother-in-law to the late king, and William, a second cousin to the late king. Now, do you know anything about world history? Know which one of these individuals wins? William. William had some advantages. He had the backing of the Roman Catholic Pope, Alexander I. He had the backing of Cardinal Hildebrand. Some of you may remember his name. He had the backing of Cardinal Hildebrand, Hilde, then Brand. And he also had the backing of many Normans who were living in England at this time, which is not surprising at all because the king had actually been a Norman, at least by education and by upbringing. So it seems like he's going to win with that type of backing. He's got the backing of the ones Alexander I and Hildebrand in control of the ecclesiastical world of that day, as well as many Normans who are actually living in England, as well as obviously the Normans living down here in western France in Normandy. So, surely enough, he does win at the Battle of Hastings, the year 1066. One of the pivotal battles of world history, or the world's pivotal dates as well. Harold was defeated and killed by William, who becomes known now as William the Conqueror, who then became King of England from 1066 to 1087. William the Conqueror now becomes king. Now I say one of the pivotal dates and one of the pivotal battles. Why, we say? Well, we don't really know, of course, what would have happened in England if the Anglo-Saxons would have just continued to rule. But we know that, without having to know that, we do know that the introduction of now Norman French culture and Norman French language and Norman French people radically changes the country and the people, as well as the language of England and the British Isles. We do know that it changes quite a bit. These people are not just Scandinavians, but now they're Scandinavians who lived in France for a while, so we speak of them as coming from a Norman French background. Now Normandy is this little province in western France just across the English Channel from England. As a matter of fact, not that far from London, because of course London is down here in the southeastern corner. Where else has Normandy figured in world history? It certainly figures in here as far as the English people are concerned. In the Second World War, the so-called D-Day of June 6, 1944. In kind of an interesting reversal of the situation, Normandy becomes the landing ground for combined American, British, and Canadian troops under General Eisenhower, who now are invading German-occupied and German-controlled France because Paris has capitulated to the German onslaught. And so now in an interesting reversal of the situations, people in France aren't invading Britain now, but people in Britain, as well as the United States and Canada, the Canadian and American and British troops under General Eisenhower, who becomes President Eisenhower because of events like this, cross the English Channel in the opposite direction and land on the beaches of Normandy. And I guess we could say that's probably the chief turning point of the Second World War. So Normandy, in two different situations over the last 1,000 years, this little province of Normandy has served very important, pivotal purposes in world history. One time to change radically the future of England. We don't know what it would have been. We just know that it would have been different than it has for the last 1,000 years if Harold would have defeated William. That would have kept it in control of the Anglo-Saxons instead of the Norman French background type people. And then secondly, it was the landing ground for the combined forces in the Second World War. So it's been an important little place in France. So I thought I would throw that in as just a historical detail. You can see how people have gone both directions across the English Channel. One time they conquered England, the next time they conquered France. Depends on which way you're going. Okay, the Norman conquest brought a virtual halt to translations of the English Bible. That's why we're studying it. For us right now, it wouldn't be that important otherwise. Brings a virtual halt to English translations. And also that's why we date our periods like we do. 450 to 1100, 11 to 1500, and 15 to 2000. That 1100 date, why use that 1100? Really 1066 if you want to be specific. But why use that 1100 date? What's important about that? Well, the Norman conquest. Then what's important about that, besides the fact it's going to change world history, for our point and purpose, which is Bible translation, what's important about that? It brings a virtual halt to the translations of the English Bible, which haven't gotten that far. Remember, most of them have been nothing but poetical paraphrases begun by people like Cædmon, the British monk, but who became the monk. But certainly they're headed in that direction. All of them have just been partial translations. But it's certainly headed in the direction of more complete and perhaps more reliable translations. Now we're going to have a virtual halt a halt that lasts practically 2 centuries. So that's going to delay English translations even more. Now, I'll tell you why it brought a halt here in just a moment with a couple of points. But again, follow my line of thought and consider this again, although I pointed it out before. Whenever we studied other languages and translations of the Bible into those, beginning way back with Syriac, it started relatively early. We just have Bibles all of a sudden. Either a whole Testament or a whole Bible just comes off, not off the press, but from the person's hand almost immediately. With English translations, we have Christianity there for centuries and centuries and centuries. About 700 years, about 7 of those centuries before Kedman comes along and does some work. And then for the next 500 or so years, he and his friends do a little here and a little there, not a great deal of work, a great amount of work is done, poetical paraphrases, and then that comes to a stop for 200 years. And it's not going to be really picked up, or really for the first time we could say begun, until the time of Wycliffe, around the beginning of the 14th century. And I think I had ended an earlier study with this little statement just because it helps remind me of the historical process of work done on English translations, that they were slow in coming, but when they came, they came. When it rains, it pours. They have really come, you see, in this century, and then a lot of them last century, and then not so many the century before, and you just work your way back. But it's almost taken 2,000 years to really get translations going in English, which is remarkable. For people as important as the English people. I mean, we had important translations done in English for the last couple of hundred years. I realize that. But still, why go so long? 1,300 years to the time of Wycliffe before we get anything. It's just remarkable that it took so long. It took a long time for these to come, but when they came, they came. Now let's go back and answer the question we just raised. Why then? The Norman conquest brought a virtual halt to translations, but why? Well, we could say in the first place that the conquerors came from a Norman French background and didn't speak Anglo-Saxon. That was obviously not their native tongue. They spoke a language that was a combination of a Western Scandinavian dialect and French. So they obviously had little concern for Bibles being available for the common man. They don't even speak Anglo-Saxon themselves. If they're going to have any Bibles done in the vernacular, it'll be done in Norman French and not in Anglo-Saxon anyway. So it's because of their cultural and linguistic background. They have a Norman French background. They don't speak Anglo-Saxon. They're not too concerned about the common man having a Bible available to him in Anglo-Saxon. They established good laws. We study this as, the conquest of England by William the Conqueror, and you think of something bad, some barbarous people. No, the Vikings, the Northmen, the Norsemen, they've been settled down for 300 years now. They're cultured, civilized people. The Norman French people are good people. Now their seafaring race back in the 700s and 800s A.D., now that was a terror as far as Europe was concerned. When these men had invented these neat little types of boats, and you've seen Viking sailboats before, and no one had had a boat like that before, and they just terrorized Europe because they could start way up there in Scandinavia somewhere and just zip through the ocean and come down there to France, and they would attack, by sea and raid and plunder and pile everything back on their boat and go back home. That's called going to work once a year, I guess. You just find a populated rich city and go invade it and conquer them, plunder it, and go back home. That's all the work you have to do for that year. So they are settled down now. They were quite a different people earlier. So they do establish good laws, but culturally, I guess we could say it was a setback for the people of England. And I think anytime you have even if the people are civilized, cultured people themselves, anytime you have a people from a different cultural or linguistic background, it's going to be a cultural setback for a period of time until they assimilate customs and language and laws of your land, or until you assimilate customs and language and laws of your conquerors. William the Conqueror and the Battle of Hastings also helped to secure the country more for Roman Catholicism, which, of course, also, as you know, was not that interested in a Bible in the vernacular for the common man. Because remember, William had the backing of the Pope as well as Hildebrand. Now you know today, do you not, that England is not a Roman Catholic country. Italy is sort of Roman Catholic. I would wonder why, but England is not a Roman Catholic country. But remember this also, this little note that you've just written down, that whenever William the Conqueror comes, he helps to, because he's had the backing of important ecclesiastical RC leaders, it helps to establish Roman Catholicism in the country of England. It helps to establish it more than it had been before. And what we're going to see over the next months, I'm sure it'll take us to finish looking at all of these English translations, is a fluctuation. Is England a Roman Catholic country, or is it a Protestant country? For 30 years it'll be Protestant, and then for the next 10 years it'll be Roman Catholic, and then for the next 15 years it'll be Protestant, and then it'll go back and forth, kind of depending on who's king or who's queen there. Elizabeth has her preferences, James I has his preferences, Charles I has his preferences, and it just goes back and forth. And it's very confusing if you're trying to ask yourself during that period of history, is England a Roman Catholic or a Protestant country? Unless you really have done your homework, and even if you've done it, you have to have it all memorized. It's impossible to remember, is it Roman Catholic or is it Protestant during this period of time. You have to attach that to certain monarchs, whether it's a queen or a king. What were their biases? And probably the country followed them. So we're just saying here, be prepared that that's going to be kind of the course of events that we will see unfold in the land of England. Probably a lot due to the Norman invasion here, because Alexander I and Hildebrand have been backers or supporters of William the Conqueror. The Normans brought French Bibles with them, Norman French Bibles with them. And a little work was done in England in Norman French translations. Now, I have the statistics about that, but I'm going to spare you those details since we're not talking about French translations of the Scripture. And we're not ever going to, because none of us speak French here. The only reason we discuss those other foreign languages to begin with is just to kind of work our way through the first millennium of the Christian era of important things, like Georgian and like Slavonic and those important languages there. Now, of course, there are translations in hundreds of languages in the world today. And there's no sense in studying that. Spanish translations, French, that would serve no purpose at all in studying that. But I just want you to know that they did do a little bit of translating work, the Norman people. But it was in a Norman French dialect. And it was done in England, but it was in a Norman French dialect, not in somewhat of an Anglo-Saxon dialect. So we're going to spare you those details, and we'll just skip over all of that. There's one reason why the Norman conquest brought a virtual halt to translations. And the second reason, obviously, was the Norman French language of the conquerors was totally different from Anglo-Saxon. But it eventually mingled with Old English. The Old English of the conquered subjects now. And through a process of mingling, which took many years, was changed into Middle English. So that means there was a period of transition from one language to the other. There was a period of transition. We have our battle in 1066, and we're talking about a Norman French language comes into the country. And we have Wycliffe, let's put him around for some translating work around 1382. I think he died in 84, but around 1382. That means all this period in between here. And here we're talking about Middle English. And of course, before the Normans and the French came in, we had Old English. Well, this Norman French is going to combine with this Old English from 1066, not to 1382, but for the next couple of hundred years, we could say, and it's going to produce Middle English. So in other words, during this period of transition, because it is a period of transition, we didn't have very little Bible work being done. What language are you going to write in? Old English, Norman French, or Middle English? What you really need is Middle English, but you need, in order to have that, you need to have time for Old English and Norman French to mingle. And then as a result will be produced the Middle English of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, if you've ever read that. So that's probably why we also have a virtual halt in translations. Not because we have some truculent overlords, namely the Normans, who come in and just say, we forbid you to do any translating work. It's just kind of an inevitable consequence of the Norman invasion. They're not too interested in work being done in Old English. They don't speak Old English. They speak Norman French, and they're not too concerned about their subjects here having Bibles they can read. What's a Bible? These guys are Vikings, former Vikings here. They're not too concerned about that. They do a little bit of work in Norman French for the religious in their midst, but what's going to be important is the mingling of the two languages to produce Middle English. Now, as we go through this period from 1066 down to 1382, remember that Old English, and you've seen these examples up on the board before, that's phasing out, and fewer people can understand Old English, can read it, write it, or speak it. Just like Hebrew in the Babylonian captivity and so forth, Hebrew kind of phases out and Aramaic comes in. Well, Old English kind of phases out and Middle English is going to come in, and so the people are in a period of transition. Now, what we're going to do in the rest of our study this morning, which won't take us that long, is we're going to look at the known partial translations that come during this time of scant production. The known partial translations. Now, from Kedman all the way through Alfric, the 8 important works we discussed during our first period of Old English, Anglo-Saxon, or from the dates 450 to 1100, that's all we have are partial translations. We don't have whole testaments done, and especially we don't have a whole Bible done. Well, it should be no surprise that after a 200-year, a 2-century layoff in work, whenever it is resumed, and it doesn't take exactly 200 years, people are doing bits and pieces throughout this period, but when it is resumed, still no complete work is done. We still only have partial translations that are done. So we're going to discuss about a handful of these. And that will then introduce us to some of the first ever in English, important complete translations that we'll start looking at next week, which of course are translations of the whole of Scripture then. Okay, number 1 then. We're going to look at some of these known partial translations of kind of the Middle English period. Remember, we're still in this transition. By the time we get to Chaucer and so forth, it's definitely Middle English. No one can speak Old anymore. It's definitely Middle English. But this time it's kind of Old English, kind of Middle, and kind of Norman French mixed together. So our first work is the Ormulum. O-R-M-U-L-U-M. Ormulum was produced by a man named Orm, O-R-M, a strange little name. Produced by a man named Orm around 1200. Now that's about 150 years after the Battle of Hastings, 1066. So notice how long it took. This is our first known work. Now other work could have been done from 1066 to 1200. We don't know about it. Let's assume that no work was done. There's almost a solid 150 years. No work is done at all. Not because we have political or ecclesiastical leaders who are forbidding work to be done. It's just a consequence of Norman invasion. It's just a consequence of the introduction of the Norman French language that little or no work is going to be done. Well, let's discuss this man Orm. We don't know a whole lot about him, but he was an Augustinian monk. He was a Roman Catholic, an Augustinian monk from a monastery a little bit north of East Midland. There we go with our English names again. A monastery a little to the north of East Midland, Midland. See, the English people are known for just drawing words together and giving us an east, a west, a north, and a south. Midland would be somewhere in the middle, but then east would be somewhere in the east of the middle land. So you get East Midland from that, which was obviously a district in England. What was the work? The Ormulum was a poetical paraphrase that reminds you of Kedman. Most of ours have been something like this. Very little prose work done. It's basically poetry that's been done in the Old English period and now in this period of transition. A poetical paraphrase of Matthew through Acts. So we get Gospels and the historical book of the New Testament. With an attached commentary. So it's a translation and a commentary. It is extant in only one manuscript, a Bodleian manuscript, the famous Bodleian Library in England. Extant in only one manuscript of 20,000 lines, which is thought by many to be the autograph. And that may well be. That means that manuscript would be 800 years old. It's thought by many to actually be the autograph, actually done by this man Orm, not a copy of a copy of a copy. Now here's how we know we're talking about transition. The vocabulary is still Teutonic, Anglo-Saxon, Old English. The vocabulary is still Teutonic. But the style and the form show many Norman traces. Now if you wonder, well, how can you have, let's take it like this, how can you have, and this wasn't necessarily true, but just to give you a parallel, the exact same alphabet from language A to language B. And yet the languages are so different that just because you can read the one doesn't mean that you can read the other. Well, that would mean that the vocabulary is different. If you have your Hebrew Bibles at home and you look up Daniel 2:4b through Daniel 7:28, Daniel the prophet in the Old Testament, you're supposed to know that was written in Aramaic. That portion was written in Aramaic, but yet if you look at it, it looks the same as Daniel chapter 1 or Daniel chapter 8. It's the exact same. Well, that's because the alphabet's the same, essentially the same. You would think, well, now I'm going to go from Hebrew, because Daniel's written in Hebrew, to this portion of Daniel written in Aramaic, and yet it's written all the same. I don't see any difference here. Well, the alphabet's essentially the same, but the vocabulary is different. CAT in one language may mean a cat, but CAT in another may mean a water tower. And so you got cat, cat, and you can read both of them, you can pronounce it, but it doesn't mean you know anything of what's going on, because the vocabulary is different. So here we're saying the vocabulary is still Old English. It's still from a Teutonic family, but the form and the style shows some Norman traces. Now, Orm, he reminds me of a little outer space figure or something. Orm and Ook, his wife. Orm. Doesn't he remind you of that? Little Orm and Ook. Either little imps from outer space or something. He himself gives us his reason for translating here in his works, a very beautiful reason. He says, if anyone wants to know why I have done this deed, I have done it so that all young Christian folk may depend upon the gospel only, and may follow with all their might its holy teaching in thought, in word, in deed. A beautiful statement from an Augustinian monk. It happens to show his position about Scripture being a Roman Catholic in this period of time. Not that that was a dominant Roman Catholic position, but it shows his position. He said, if you want to know why I've done this deed, I've done it so that all young Christian folk may depend upon the gospel only, and may follow with all their might its holy teachings in thought, in word, and in deed. Then we come to a second work. We have the stories of Genesis and Exodus rendered into English poetry around the middle of the 13th century, about 50 years after the time of little Orm and Ook and their children Oop and Uz. Now notice it's still poetry, and this has been the dominant vehicle of English translation expression up until this period, and right up into this period is English poetry. Then then number 3, we don't know much about some of these. That's why I'm passing over them. When we get to Richard Rolle, we'll say a little more about him. We know about Rolle and Orme. Number 3, toward the end of the 13th century, we have the Psalter. So let's say around maybe 1290. Toward the end of the 13th century, we have the Psalter done in metrical form. So again, it's all put to music. Doing psalms in that fashion would make a lot of sense. If you're going to put any book to music, that'd be the one to do, I suppose. And then after the beginning of the 14th century, now we're up into the same century in which Chaucer and Wycliffe both lived. After the beginning of the 14th century, we have 2 prose translations done of the Psalter. First time now that we've seen the Psalter done, or anything done for that matter, in prose. So let's give ourselves maybe 1310, just so you can see a date on your paper, although I don't know, no one really knows the exact date, but so you can see a date around 1310. 2 prose translations of the Psalter. And we'll look at them as A and B under number 4 then. Okay, A. One of these is in a West Midland English dialect, which is kind of a funny combination of several of these that we've listed up here, plus whatever the local variation of that was. And you can go in many local places. It doesn't have to be as broad as the north and the south here in the United States. You can just go into a little hamlet somewhere in, eastern Kentucky or eastern Tennessee, a little hamlet somewhere in there, and they speak an entirely different English than any of the rest of us speak. Whether you live in Tennessee or Kentucky or Virginia or the Carolinas or California, not only do people in California speak differently than people in New York or people in New Jersey, you can have people that live in different hamlets in the mountains there because they're so isolated. They just have their own particular form. So anyway, a West Midland English dialect done from the Vulgate, evidently. And it is often ascribed to William of Shoreham. But this is probably not true. William of Shoreham. Shore, S-H-O-R-E-H-A-M. Shoreham. William of Shoreham. Probably not true. And then B, another of the 2 prose psalters, was done by Richard Rolle. R-O-L-L-E. We know a little bit more about him in this one. He lived from 1295 to 1347. He was an English mystic and hermit who studied at Oxford, but then at the age of 19, he broke with the scholastic teachings, the university teachings, in favor of the simple life. Many people have done that over the course of higher education. You broke with the scholastic teachings in favor of a more simple life. That's a theoretical, non-workable life sometimes. How many angels can stand on the head of a pin? There were fists swung over important matters like that. He traveled around and just taught local people. That was a simple life for him. He was good. I'm not criticizing him. He probably made a right move. He lived the end of his life at Hampole, 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 which was near a convent of nuns. Now, he made a very literal prose translation of the Psalms into English, also evidently done from the Vulgate, which was incorporated into his verse-by-verse commentary, which is also something we've seen earlier, a translation with a running commentary. All right, then the 5th work. These are all partial works done. The last one we're going to discuss this morning. Finally, we have toward the end of the 14th century, which would put us right up in the time when Wycliffe and his associates are doing their work, 1382. Toward the end of the 14th century, we have a version of the New Testament epistles. Now, that has been rare so far. We've seen Gospels, we've seen Psalms, we've seen Pentateuch. Epistles, all the epistles, that's been relatively rare. So finally and thankfully, we have a version of the New Testament epistles, probably written for monks and nuns, probably by and for monks and nuns. Say, well, how do we know that? Well, the prologues and epilogues of the epistles, the prologues and epilogues, are filled with the terms brothers and sisters. That's what the monks and the nuns, would refer to one another as. So that's just a little clue that it was probably written for and by monks and nuns. So they'd say, brothers and sisters. It's always, plural like that. Like I'm speaking of my fellow monks. Or she is speaking of her fellow nuns, brothers and sisters. Now at a later time, Acts and the first few chapters of Matthew were added to this work. This came at a later time. New Testament epistles. Then at a later time, Acts and the first few chapters of Matthew were added to this work. And then the whole work is begun with the history of Genesis and Exodus, from creation to the giving of the law. So you have kind of scattered references here in Scripture. You've got Genesis and Exodus just up to the giving of the law, chapters 19 and 20 in Exodus. Then you got the first few chapters of Matthew, and then you have Acts through, Jude, to give us all of our epistles, Acts through Jude. Now, if I may be forgiven this fault this morning, my examples that I was going to show you of some of this partial Middle English work are in Massachusetts instead of here in Vermont. So if I may be pardoned of that this morning, I will try my best to bring them next time, and we'll attach what I say about that to the end of this message, and then we'll do whatever message we're supposed to do then. So just remember that, and I was going to attach it right here, so it fits at the end anyway, because I want to show you something about something about this last work I just mentioned to you here, something from, I think, the book of Matthew and the book of Hebrews. And so you would want to have with you, if you've happened to copy down some of that Old English before, whenever we look at this next week, so you can compare. I'm not going to bring Old English too, so you can compare from your notes your Old English with what this Middle English is going to look like. It's kind of a combination now of Old English and Norman French that changes the language into Middle English. So we see that little work has been done in the first 200 years after the Norman invasion. Little work. All that has been done has been partial work. All right. But that which has been done in preparation for the great service rendered by the morning star of the Reformation, one John Wycliffe. And Wycliffe is the one with whom we will have to deal in the next few messages then. And he's all that we have to say after this morning concerning the Middle English period. He's so dominant of a figure that we can just skip over these first five real hurriedly and get to John Wycliffe. Okay, I did promise you this morning that I would bring what I forgot last time. I want to kind of go over this real briefly together. If you happen to have any of your Old English, you would want to get that out if you copied any of that down before and compare it with this Middle English, and you're going to see what a big difference we've seen as we've had this influence by the Norman French invaders, and it's kind of changed the language during this period of transition. And hopefully this should be somewhat more recognizable. All right, I meant to bring a lollipop. The first one to name the passage. You got to be exactly right, though. Okay, I'm still waiting. Where is it? Where? Exact passage. What? He's taking a stab. No lollipops for stabs. Well, I was just testing your Bible knowledge there.
But what is interesting about this, why go ahead and look it up, especially if you had any Bible with you, but, pardon? 9 to 13, is it like 9b through 13a, something like that? But what else is interesting about this? And what is this, by the way? Last week, Middle English, one of those examples, I think was the last example that we gave. The work that had the epistles and later Acts and some of Revelation, some of Matthew had been added and so forth. Lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil, and then what else? You have your King James with you? You dropped an ending? The thine is the kingdom. The ecclesiastical, the so-called liturgical ending there, for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. And we've said that, that really shouldn't be in there. That was a later liturgical addition, probably from, 1 Chronicles 29, where David prays that type of prayer. And we even sing a song based on that from over there in 1 Chronicles 29. So this goes back very early. It doesn't have that spurious mark in it, you see. So King James certainly wasn't translated from that. Now, how do you like this compared to Old English, though? You can hardly recognize Old English, right? And yet this is still rather odd in its spelling, the way we would spell it today. But it is most definitely more recognizable, though. Our Father that art in heaven, I guess, hallowed be thy name. Just look at these spellings. Thy kingdom come to us. Thy will be done as in heaven and in earth. Our each day's bread, our daily bread, give us today, and forgive us our debties as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil. That's it in Matthew. So there's an example of Middle English. There's another example. Where's this found? Hebrews 1, where are the verses? Verses 1 through what? You got almost all of it. 3. King James has it in this, and you might want to, I may leave this up here a little bit and you copy down what you want to of that, because Hebrews 1, the first 3 or 4 verses there, is such a famous passage. It doesn't really matter whose version you have it in, it's just beautiful poetry. And probably it would be difficult to outdo the King James. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. And why I say you may want to copy this down is when we get to Tyndall's work and other people's work, we'll give you the same paragraph again, and then you can compare it and see how it's changed. Now, let's see, God hath, I don't know why it's wise spoken. It's wise spoken, a lot of wise up there, why ordained, but wise spoken in many manners, sometime in prophets to our fathers, but all their last in these days, he hath wise spoken, there it is again, to us in his Son, whom he hath wise ordained, to been heir of all things, by whom also he made the world. I mean, you can read that. You can obviously read that. And he is the brightness of his bliss and the figure of his substance, bringing all things through the word of his virtue or power and so forth. Really, the sentence goes down through verse 4, but I didn't know how much more I would be able to get on there. Now, that wasn't nearly as difficult to comprehend. Now, it's going to change when we get up into modern English, like when we get to the King James, the original 1611 King James. And it's changed since 1611 until now, obviously, as well. but I don't think the change will be nearly as significant. This is obviously very readable to all of us, and I don't think the change will be as significant when we go from middle to modern as we went from old to middle. That's where a big change takes place. Because if you can read Old English, it's like you can read a foreign language then.